p.m. Eastern Time. So, welcome everyone to this session of Marxism 2021. This is part of the ABCs of Socialism stream. The talk is entitled A Rebel's Guide to Marx. My name is Faylene Bobier. I'm a member of the Toronto East Branch of the International Socialists, and I'll be chairing the meeting. I'm going to ask people to make sure that you're on mute and to turn off your cameras, except for when you're speaking and or asking a question. It will just help save bandwidth and hopefully make a smoother meeting. So our speaker today is Iannis Delatolas. He's a New York-based socialist and a member of Marx 21 in the US. Yanni will be speaking for about 30 minutes, after which there'll be lots of time for discussion and questions. So whenever you're ready, Yannis, go ahead.
Hi, comrades. Thank you for having this meeting. So in 1989, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Stalinist regimes, Marx and his works were marginalized. Marx, in general, and being a Marxist, were considered at best, out of date, something, old and past of the past time. You may remember Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history text that claimed that the era of wars and revolutions had come to an end, and stability was now the way of the future, and the world was going to be dominated by free markets, and capitalism was as good as it gets. But this is not the picture today. In fact, even in the belly of the beast in the United States, we have seen, going back for some years now, that socialism has become a very popular idea, especially with young people. Obviously, in the previous session, people discussed the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, but also figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the very impressive growth of the DSA. All are signs of this leftward shift in the US that persisted, and one can say even intensified during the worst years of the Trump era. Let's remember, for example, the teacher strikes that spread from one side of the US to the other, winning important victories and concessions and inspiring workers in other sectors. Let's also not forget the anti-racist rebellion, where 26 million people demonstrated against the racist police murder of George Floyd and for Black lives. And coming on the heel of that rebellion, the anti-racist strikes by US unions for Black lives. Remember, for example, Angela Davis speaking in Oakland at the strike of the Longshoremen's Union, where she stood up and said to the workers at the picket, "This is the real legacy, of Marx." What she said to the workers that you have the power to end racism. And this is really the real legacy of Marx, the idea that the working class is central to the struggle towards a better world. That workers have the power to do this precisely because of the role they hold within capitalist production. But I will go over all this in a bit. The ongoing capitalist crisis of 2008, from which the economy never fully recovered, was only amplified with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this brought into sharper focus all of the fault lines of capitalism, the inability of the system to regulate itself in order to address the climate crisis has further contributed to millions of people looking towards socialism for answers. And in this context, we have seen Marx make an incredible comeback, not just in left-wing circles, that's to be expected, of course, but a couple of years ago, even in some of the ruling class press, we saw such statements as, for example, the Financial Times said at one point, even the best 21st century social science pales besides the complexity and richness of Marxist protean 19th century thought. And another example, The Economist had an article a couple of years ago with the title, Rulers of the World, Read Karl Marx. Of course, the ruling class's interest in Marx ends with the analysis of the pitfalls of capitalism, while for us, Marx and his work are important for other reasons. Marx has made a comeback because at the root of all the crisis we face today lies capitalism. And now everybody talks about the economic system and capitalism itself as being the root of the problem. But it wasn't always like that in the US, for sure. When I was active in the 1990s as a socialist in New York, um, we were the only ones who brought up capitalism in political discussions. And people often had a baffled look on their face. Capitalism, as opposed to what? It was kind of like that, you know. Some would even say, of course, you know, the good old insult, go back to Russia, etc. Clearly, we didn't recruit those people, but the situation has changed. If you remember, there was a fork in the road, as um, it was called at the time. It was the demonstration in Seattle in 1999 that came to be known as the Battle of Seattle. That was really the start of when people started naming the problem, and the problem was identified by a new, very militant movement as being capitalism. The crisis we are facing today is bringing into sharp focus what lies at the center of this. Um, for example, as I already mentioned, the environmental crisis, the ongoing economic crisis that the economy never recovered from since 2008, and also, most importantly, the threat of fascism and the far right that uses this crisis to advance its racist agenda internationally. Consider for a moment the real possibility that Le Pen, the French crypto-fascist, might win the next elections in France. All of this, all of these crises, the triple crisis, as we discussed this in the IST, in the International Socialist Tendency, has brought Marx uh, back at the center as people are looking for solutions. So if you're going to discuss a bit about Marx, Marx was above all a revolutionary, as Engels said at Marx's funeral. Marx grew to political maturity in Germany in the 1830s and 1840s. He was a middle-class student of philosophy. He was drawn into the democracy movement in Germany and worked alongside left Hegelians who were aiming to stamp out feudalism and establish democratic rights and basically replicate the experience of the Great French Revolution. Germany at this time was a patchwork of repressive states. The democracy movement wanted both national unity and an end to oppression, an end to censorship, and also basically a democratically elected government. So we can say two important events characterized this period. Obviously, it was that it was taking place after the Great French Revolution that had broken the absolute power of the monarchy and opened up questions of democracy and liberation. And the other important development was the Industrial Revolution that had created a new system of industrial capitalism with large factories where entire working class families were swallowed up in the production, including children, and working in horrendous conditions and suffering, while the capitalist factory owners were becoming extremely rich. But Marx was involved in these early political struggles in 1840, and first the 1848 revolutions, which swept Europe and helped to complete the work of the French Revolution. While the early capitalists had supported the French Revolution, in 1848, in those revolutions, the workers' movement was actually very involved and active, and the capitalists at the time saw this as a threat to their power. This became very clear to Marx in the early 1840s when he was working with some progressive capitalists in a pro-democracy alliance in Cologne and writing for a newspaper then. The capitalists would fork out money for Marx to write, but only in order to target the old regime that they were trying to dispose. They did not want him to go very far with his critique against capital. But the era of bourgeois revolutions was coming to an end, and a new era of workers' revolution was beginning. After the defeat of the 1848 revolutions and the repression that followed, Marx was eventually expelled from Germany and lived most of his life as a refugee in Paris, Brussels, and in London. Um, in Paris, he began to frequent socialist meetings. He was also heavily influenced at this point in his life by his meeting with Frederick Engels, who had returned from Manchester, and he helped where he was running basically his family's factory. Engels had a very first-hand account of the exploitation and misery that the workers had to suffer. He was basically a class trader and a great revolutionary himself. Let's not forget that Engels wrote the book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, a study of the industrial working class in Victorian times. And also Engels wrote a very seminal book for our tradition that we often refer to in discussing issues of gender and sexual oppression. The book is The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Engels also went on to financially support Marx and his family as Marx embarked on writing his sweeping analysis of capitalism, the 3 volumes of Capital. So the meeting of Marx and Engels was very important and a defining one for Marx's development. But let's go back to the time when Engels and Marx first met. It was Engels' lover, a working class Irish immigrant, Mary Burns, who was a militant at a factory, and she undoubtedly played a key role introducing first Engels and through him Marx to the workers' movement, which was in those days highly advanced in the northwest of England. So we can say that due to Engels and Mary Burns, Marx discovered the working class. The most important organization Marx built was the International Working Men's Association, which he founded while he was living in London, and while he had started working on Capital. He was writing Capital, but Marx was always an organizer. I think this is something important for us to keep in mind. This was a genuine workers' organization drawing together various continental socialist organizations and also some British trade unions. The organization was not simply interested in economic questions. In Capital, Marx refers to the great event of contemporary history, the American Civil War. Among other things, this was a war in which slavery was a key issue. As Marx put it, labor in white skin cannot emancipate itself, while labor in black skin is branded. This was an issue that the International Working Men's Association took up. It also reflected the best internationalist traditions of the working class. One of the after effects of the American Civil War was the shutting down of the cotton trade, and that caused mass unemployment and misery for thousands of workers in England. Yet these same workers overwhelmingly supported the North in the Civil War, particularly once Lincoln was forced to decree the emancipation of the slaves in order to win the war. So what this shows is that for Marx, socialism was from the very start, very much engaged with the struggle against oppression and overall human liberation. So for comrades who are interested in reading more about the life and work of Karl Marx, I would highly recommend Alex Skanliviko's book, The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx. Maybe one of the comrades can drop a link to that in the chat here. Marx went on to be a founding member also of the First International while continuing to write Capital, as I said. 150 years or so later, after he wrote Capital, it remains a pivotal work for all who want to understand in depth the workings of capitalism. Um, so what I'm going to go a little bit into the ideas that Marx developed. What do we mean by historical materialism? Marx examined human society through the prism of material reality in which he lived. And this material reality that is the one that determines our everyday reality, how we live, and how we feel, and what we think. This is a break uh, with idealism and the philosophers that up to that time that the ideas people held in their heads thought that there was the ideas people held that defined the reality. Inevitably, this means that the way he saw history was radically different from historians of the time who saw history as a linear accumulation of events, where great men and less often great women were credited with pushing history forward. This is why history, as it is taught in schools, is so boring and can seem like an endless list of names and dates. Instead, Marx turned this on its head and placed ordinary people at the center and the scene of history. So, uh, for Marx, what makes history move forward are the existing class antagonisms in a period and the struggle between classes with opposing economic interests. Um, and not the actions of a certain king or a powerful individual. For Marx and for Marxists, capitalism is not eternal. It is a stage in the development of society, just as feudalism was replaced by capitalism when the bourgeoisie and the social relations it fostered created the conditions that led to the revolutions that deposed the aristocracy and placed the capitalist class in power. And by extension, the capitalist class is not going to reign forever. Capitalism is another stage in history, and one that could be replaced by a more just social order with the intervention of the working class and the overthrow of capitalism. And, we should keep in mind that now there is nothing inevitable about this, which is why we say and do, and what we do as socialism, excuse me, which is why what we say and do as socialists is very important as we try to build the organizations that could provide leadership in the workers' movement in the future. Capitalism is a very dynamic system. Look at the immense production of goods that happens every day across the globe. And also look at the immense waste and environmental degradation daily as products are produced not based on what society needs, but based on capitalist competition and the market. Millions live in misery and a minority enriches themselves. What all this means is that there is the potential for workers through a revolution to take over the means of production, the factories, the hospitals, the schools, and run them for the interests of the working class and create a just and a socialist society. But as I said, this is not automatic. Notice how we have entered a period of rapid climate change that makes the need for revolution very urgent and pressing, more than ever. I'm going to go now to touch on some of the basic ideas that Marx developed in his political economy. But we must keep always in mind that Marx was motivated in his work by his hatred of capitalism and the horrors inflicted on workers and the vulnerable. He wrote with one explicit goal and aim: to understand how capitalism works in order to destroy it, in order to arm the workers' movement with the ideas and the tools towards this task. And in doing so, Marx showed that the working class can become the gravedigger of capitalism. Not only does capitalism create the conditions for socialism in the sense of creating sufficient wealth to do away with scarcity, it also creates, above all, its own gravediggers. And I will go into that in a little bit. The whole process of capitalism, Marx argued, is founded on a new form of exploitation. All class societies throughout history rested on exploitation. In ancient Rome, there were slaves and slave owners. Under feudalism, there were lords and peasants. But there's something different about capitalist exploitation, and that is that exploitation is hidden under the wage packet. Basically, Marx's argument is that the worker creates greater wealth in the work during the workday than is required for him to reproduce his labor power, basically to maintain himself, his family, etc. But no capitalist, will go and tap the worker on the shoulder, say after 4 hours and say, okay, you're done now making your living and reproducing your own labor power. From now on, for the next 4 hours, you're working to make me rich. No capitalist is ever going to say this, but Marx showed in Capital that this is exactly how capitalism works. So this exploitation, in fact, poses a problem for capitalism because there's a two-way dependency. The worker depends on the capitalist for work, and the capitalist, obviously owns the factory, the means of production. Workers have nothing aside from the ability to sell their labor power. Workers can't work without the capitalists, of course, and the capitalist depends on the workers to do the actual work. In other words, capitalist creates a working class majority on whom it is utterly dependent. If a manager vanishes from a factory, it won't have a big impact. If a group of workers go and strike, then the factory paralyzes. In a general strike, a whole country can paralyze, or even a continent. And when Marx was writing capitalism was really a fairly new system, and it was very, isolated. It existed mostly in parts of England, parts of Northern Europe and North America, and the working class was proportionally much smaller than today. Today, capitalism obviously reigns internationally, and the working class is global. There are about 2 billion, workers globally. And to these, if you add their families, their children, and the elderly, there is clear a working class majority on the planet. And not only is the working class vast, it is also highly concentrated in big, giant cities and big industrial centers. So this creates basically the conditions for when workers fight collectively, they tend to create new democratic organs of workers' power. Marx realized this in 1871 by looking at the Paris Commune, which was basically the first workers' revolution, where the workers took over the city and ran it for about 2 months. But we have seen in every revolutionary upheaval since then that workers do create workers' councils, and it's a form of workers' rule that comes up naturally through the course of the struggle. So not only is a revolution necessary in order to break the logic of capitalism and free the working class, it is also part of the process through which workers change themselves as they're changing the world. In the course of the struggle, they realize the power that lies in the unity, and they rid themselves of reactionary ideas, of backward thinking, of sexism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, etc. So Marx showed how the workers and the capitalists are interlocked in an antagonistic relationship, and are in a relationship of interdependence. Because of the role workers play in production, they have the power to shut it down. It is this power that makes the working class central to revolutionary change. Workers can become the grave diggers of capitalism. And it is this that we refer to as the centrality of the working class. Now, um, because the ultimate site of profit generation is the workplace, capitalists devote a great deal of time and energy to making sure that the workers work long and hard. The reality of exploitation ensures that there are struggles over the questions such as how long the working day would be, the extent and the intensity of the exploitation. This is all extensively discussed in Marx's Capital. The wage, the amount workers receive to reproduce the labor power is not a fixed amount. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and class struggle is one of them. The reality of exploitation and the resulting battles over it show how class struggle between capitalists and workers is an inherent part of capitalist society. As they resist, workers can become aware of their power they hold, and this power is considerable. But here lies a crucial contradiction. Unlike with other forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, the exploitation of workers is actually a source of power for the working class, and it's the ability workers have to go to strike and stop working, withdraw their labor, to occupy the workplace. And this is, in fact, the power to stop the accumulation of profits generated by capitalists. Marx showed that with class struggle, workers can resist and reduce in the short term with strikes how they're exploited, and that ultimately, however, workers can take over the means of productions through a revolution and cancel the capitalist class and capitalism itself, and usher in a new society that is based on human need with a planned economy with the workers' own and run the means of production towards satisfying human need and for the benefit of the majority of society. But Marx didn't invent this nice idea of revolution while reading books in a library. Marx learned this from the workers themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, the first workers' revolution was the Paris Commune of 1871. And even though the Paris Commune only lasted 2 months, it offered a glimpse of the workers' democracy and a radically egalitarian society that had not been seen before. Marx looked at these events and learned from the workers themselves. He wrote, as a result, a pamphlet called The Civil War in France. And it was based on speeches that he gave to the First International. It is a very important work for all socialists, but it was Marx's writings here on the nature of the capitalist state that later Lenin expanded on his own work, The State and Revolution, in 1917, during the revolution, when he was arguing that there had to be a second revolution to actually put workers in power in 1917. So Paris, a little background on the Commune. Paris in 1870 was left completely battered and it was under siege as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. The Republican government that had overthrown Napoleon III had delivered nothing to the workers and the poor who lived in squalor. Who lived in squalor and suffered greatly. There was no liberty, there was no equality, and no fraternity for the workers and the poor of Paris. There was mass unemployment, and it was said that 60% of Parisians could not even afford to pay for their own funerals. Wow, I just realized this sounds a bit like the Bronx where I live today. Anyway, so the Commune achieved very radical reforms not seen since. It abolished conscription. It established public canteens and made large gains for women's rights. For example, divorce was granted on demand. Marx recognized that the Commune represented a new form of radical workers' democracy. He said, a working class government, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. Among the Commune's radical democratic principles, one was that all public officials were elected and subjected subjected to immediate recall. They were paid the wage of the average worker, which was about 6,000 francs. This was done in order to prevent corruption. So Marx wrote, instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class to represent the people in parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people. The Commune was a living and breathing example of what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was the actual collective control of the economy by the workers, not a small minority claiming to represent the workers, but this was direct democracy. And basically the working class had the power in the Paris Commune. By looking at the events of the Paris Commune, Marx developed his theory of the state. The tragedy with which the Commune ended in the slaughter is really what enabled Marx to do so. The communards underestimated the power and determination of the ruling class to fight and take back power in Paris from the communards. Because while the Commune was going forward, providing gains and reforms and improving the conditions of people in Paris as much as that was possible in the siege, the bourgeoisie led by Adolphe Thiers was mobilizing to crush the Commune. And guess who he was doing this with? The Prussians, the people they were fighting with, the two enemies, the Prussians and the French, united to fight the Commune because they realized what a threat it was to the status quo. And as a result, the Commune was drowned in blood, and possibly maybe up to 50,000 workers were killed as the Paris, was taken back by the counter-revolution. So the importance of the Civil War in France. Sorry. I want to make sure, I didn't see a notice about running out of time, so interrupt me, please. So the importance of the book, The Civil War in France. It shows both the huge potential and the terrible risks that the revolutionaries can face. If workers do not smash the old bourgeois state, they allow the old regime to take back power. And Marx wrote about that. One thing especially was proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold on the ready-made state machinery and yield it for its own purposes. The second thing that is important about this book, The Civil War in France, is that it showed that workers can take power and change societies. And revolutionary socialists ever since have been looking and drawing inspiration by this work of Marx. It's funny because I was finishing the last touches on my presentation today, and I got a notification on my iPhone from the New York Times. Breaking news. President Biden said G7 leaders agreed on initiatives to counter Chinese influence, but nations failed on a timeline to eliminate coal use. I mean, seriously, this is where the ruling class is. It is a bankrupt class. It cannot even regulate capitalism to stop the inevitable destruction of the planet. I mean, this is everywhere, it's on Netflix, it's everywhere. Everybody knows what is coming, and yet the system cannot stop and correct this. So revolution today is more urgent than ever. And I think In this, the work of Karl Marx and all the other revolutionaries who built on his work are indispensable. And I'm going to leave it here, and let's hopefully have a discussion and touch on more things that I didn't have the chance to do so. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yanni. So we have, as I said, we've got lots of time for discussion. So if you do have a question or a comment, you can either just raise your hand using the raise your hand icon, or if you're not comfortable doing that, you can also put your comment or your question into the chat window. And basically, so we'll take a series, I'll take people in turn as I see you, raising your hand. And Yanni will come back at the end of the discussion if there are things that he wants to come back on or questions that he wants to answer. So do feel free if someone asks a question in the discussion, you can also feel free as a participant to, to respond to other people's comments and questions during the discussion. So the floor is open. Ranjit?
Hi, thank you so much. So my name is Ranjit, and I work with LGBTQ plus refugee and newcomer people. I have been for many years. So one of the challenges I would say that I face whenever I try to politicize people is that even when I criticize Canada, they compare immediately with their home country situations and say, no, for us, this is still much better. So that is a common response I get. And I validate that. Who am I to invalidate their real life experiences? And then at the same time, when they come to Canada, they are most precariously employed. They face all kinds of systemic issues from racism, homophobia, transphobia, lack of access to housing, employment, and so on. And quite a lot of our LGBTQ plus refugee and newcomer people are working as PSWs, construction workers, assistants, cleaners, and because of that, they have got COVID. So I am trying another option. This is a continuous dialogue, conversation with the group, owning the margins. So how do you own your margins? So this is the margin, we are pushed to the boundaries and you need to own it. And then moment of owning it, your political moment and fighting back, resistance. So I would like to give some ideas from you and our participants about this grassroots organizing of the most marginalized groups. I can talk about these with and I'm immensely aware of my privileges whenever I talk about grassroots organizing and even political awareness. So, okay, I'll stop at that and I would like your views. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ranjit. Okay, so again, I have an open speakers list. If people want to respond to that, or if people have other questions or things they'd like to comment on. Don't be shy.
Jeremy put his hand up, or their hand up, in the chat.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Hey there, Iannis, thank you so much for your talk. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so I appreciated the way you condensed that information. And like that was kind of a big body of law, or not law, history and sort of theory you kind of presented to us. My question though is, well, in my experience, when you're trying to sort of communicate sort of like socialist ideals, or which to me are very intuitive, but for people who are sort of like, I guess, uninitiated to sort of Marxism, what is, over the course of your sort of like career in this, what is your sort of suggestion? I feel like the best way, me personally, is kind of meet people where they are and work from there instead of just kind of being antagonistic right off the bat. And I don't know what that means for, I guess for different people, that's a different sort of conversation, but I was just curious what you have to say about that, if you have anything. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bradley?
Yeah, I think the whole thing of meeting people where they're at is always the key, right? And one of the things I find most exciting about what Iannis was talking there, and about the the body of work of Marx and Marxists since then, is this idea that the world we're fighting for has almost nothing in common with the world we're living in, right? And almost any other political current or reformist project of some sort, whatever their merits, right, is still about small changes to the world we live in, right? And what we're talking about is a world where people live in harmony with each other and with nature. And we think that's possible because we've seen past examples where people have managed that for however many short times, like the Paris Commune, or Russia briefly, or all kinds of different revolutions in the 20th century for short periods of time. People were able to put together these workers' councils and things like that. And we can really see like the necessity of that now, right? There's nothing about the way we conduct our lives that's sustainable, right? And everything about the way we go to work individually and individually decide, what school you might go to, or if you're fortunate enough to, to continue on in education or whatever, or what kind of job you might get, or what kind of city you want to live in, or if those choices aren't really much made by yourself because you're a migrant worker or a migrant student or a refugee. Every part of that is, making individual decisions that are either forced on you, or if they're by choice, they make things worse, right? Like if it's quicker to drive than take the bus, you're making the world a worse place by driving, but you're getting to work, in half the time. So you're making your life better, right? And on and on and on. And I just think that the idea that we're going to have, that people can build a society where we run our own lives is so out there compared to what people's day-to-day lives are. That's what I find is the hardest to explain to people. Like, we're not talking about a little less getting rid of fossil fuels. We're not talking just about getting rid of fossil fuels, or we're not talking about lowering the amount of racism that people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We're talking about a world that's completely free of fossil fuels and free of racism. But that's only possible if people build it themselves, right? And this idea that we all have agency, I think, is very powerful. But I think it's also very hard to communicate to people because it's so unique to Marxist politics that's largely been extinguished by reformism on one side, or liberalism and things like that, and of course Stalinism on the other extreme. So I don't know, I just that to me is the most exciting part about this, is that we know from historical examples that people can organize themselves to build a better world, and it looks nothing at all like the world we live in today.
Thank you so much.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. One of them is from James. He says, I think COVID has helped expose that the working class is still highly concentrated in large industry, especially in logistics and supply chain and service. There was a thought prior that the massive deindustrialization, and for some reason I can't scroll down anymore. Bradley, maybe you can read the rest of that.
I'll start over at the beginning because I'm not quite sure where you got.
Okay, thank you.
So I think COVID has helped expose that the working class is still highly concentrated in large industry, especially in logistics and supply chain and service. There was a thought prior that the massive deindustrialization somehow changed the dynamics of the working class, but we see now that while there have been shifts, the dynamics have remained. Workers' power still exists.
Thank you. And then Jeremy, I think just responding to what you were saying, Bradley, I definitely feel the biggest hurdle in these conversations is sort of what you're saying sounds too good to be true, which I'm sure people have probably experienced when trying to talk about socialist politics. Okay, so we have an open list again if people have other questions or comments. I might put myself next. I guess that's kind of abusing my power as chair, but it was sort of, I'm not sure, Ranjit, this is, I don't think exactly a response to what you were saying, but one of the things that struck me, when we talk about the most marginalized groups in society, or, which could be immigrants, or talking about racialized communities, I think one of the things that COVID has also kind of made clear is that it's often those groups that actually make up a large percentage of what we call, or what we now recognize, are essential workers. If you think about healthcare workers, if you think about people who deliver groceries, people who work in grocery stores, people who work in, as James was talking about, logistics and, package delivery and that kind of thing. Part of what COVID has shown, I think, is that they actually do hold quite a bit of power in society. And I think, to Jeremy's point, what Marx argued, or one of the things he argued, is that most people, for most of the time, most people go along with, the way things are as the only way that things can be, as if capitalism was sort of the only possible way of organizing ourselves. But often for most people, their ideas change, not necessarily through reading, although that's important. And I'm sure lots of us who are here today who are interested in socialism are also interested in reading politics. But a lot of people's ideas change fundamentally when they're in struggle. And I think that's partially because they start to see what Marx argued, that the working class actually needs to be the agent of change in society and not sort of the subject that's being acted upon. I mean, most of the time in our workplaces, often we do feel, I think, like objects who are being acted upon by forces that are outside our control. But just right now, for example, in Ontario, there are a number of small strikes, and some of them not that small, that seem to are popping up sort of as we not come to the end of COVID, but I mean, it's still very much here. But people who I think gained a certain sense of what their real worth was through the pandemic. Carolyn mentioned earlier at the opening session about a group of workers at a factory that makes all different kinds of bottles in Toronto called Rexplast. And most of the workers are women. Most of them are from the Punjab, and many of them have been working at that factory for like 25, 30 years. And they make basically not much above minimum wage. So, and they're basically asking for very small concessions from the employer who's currently paying scabs, you know, 2/3 as much of what he would pay them to do much more than he would pay them to do the work. But they're not backing down. Or just recently, there's a company called Wine Rack in Toronto that sells booze. And you can imagine they were probably fairly busy during the pandemic. And those workers are now out on strike. And they're a group, often mostly younger workers, who make something like $14.40 an hour, and the employer is talking about giving them a 5 cent wage rise next year. And they're saying that's not adequate, which it obviously isn't. So I think one of the important insights of Marx was really how much struggle itself is critical to changing people's ideas, from seeing themselves as powerless to understanding that because of the way capitalism works, they actually do have the power to shut down capital and to threaten the bosses in that way. So, and I think Iannis maybe has something that he'd like to say. Go ahead, Iannis.
Yeah, about the question, I think it was Jeremy, right? About how we relate our ideas to people, I think is very, very important because, this discussion here obviously is for Marxists and people who are interested in Marx and socialists who want to understand some of the, the what makes the backbone of the theory. But, we don't go to people like that on the street who are, at a demonstration for gay rights, and smack them with this theory, we try to relate to people, by being engaged in the struggles that people are engaged with at a specific time. So, if you go to a strike, maybe you don't start with the dictatorship of the proletariat, but you start maybe, how can the strike win? And if you go to a demonstration for gay rights, or trans rights, you have to be able to, we need to be able to relate to people in a way that's constructive, and not just smacking people over the head with 3 volumes of Capital. Yeah, but that is a very important question, because if you can't talk to ordinary people who are not familiar with Marxism, then it means you're really kind of isolated and you can't relate these wonderful ideas to people.
Thanks, Yanni. Okay, so we have an open floor again for people. Really, any kind of question you have, could be something that Yanni talked about, or maybe something he didn't talk about. Please feel free. And I think there have been some suggested readings put into the chat as well for people, including the book that Yanni referred to, The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx, which was written by Alex Kalinikos, who spoke at the opening plenary, and it's a very good intro to Marx and some of his his main ideas. Okay, I'm gonna take ask one last time if there are any questions or comments. Bradley's got a chant for us in the chat.
This is Andrea. I have something
Yeah,
to
go
mention.
ahead.
Okay. One of my understandings is that Marx said that each historical situation has to be analyzed in its own terms, or each when one is planning rebellion or change. So to look closely at the political and economic conditions of the time and social conditions and plan according to that. And I want to ask if that understanding is correct, and I think it is, but also I like that this means that Marxism isn't codified, that it's an approach to life and living, and I think that's an important thing to be able to communicate to people. It has a different look every year, essentially.
Yeah, that's an important point. Thanks. Okay, well, not seeing any other questions or comments. I think we'll maybe give it back to Yanni. Now, the next sessions start at 3:30. So if you want to, after Yanni is done, if you want to go attend another session, sort of get the end of another session, or just turn up for the next sessions at 3:30. The next session in this stream, which is called the ABCs of Socialism, is a talk on police and the capitalist state, which is pretty relevant right now, I would think, with all of the calls for defunding the police. There's also a session on Indigenous sovereignty and climate justice. And then the other session is how workers' power will change the world. So those are all sessions that will be starting at 3:30 Eastern Time. And don't forget to join us for the final rally of Marxism, which will begin right after the next set of sessions at 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time. So if there aren't any other questions or comments, I'll give it back to Yanni.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind that Marxism is a developing theory since the time of Marx. We don't take things as a dogma that's basically, oh, Marx said this and this and this. Maybe things have changed, and maybe we have to analyze some aspects of what he said, or it's just a guide basically to action. And I think that's the takeaway. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we're going to say, if you want to change the world, go and vote, and that's it, you're done. Some aspects of Marxism, I think, really are permanent, in a sense, that there needs to be a revolution. If you look at left-wing, reformist governments, we have seen, the Syriza government, for example, that tried to institute some reforms within the existing framework of the capitalist state, and it failed. It was crushed. This is, in Greece, it was came on the heels of an anti-austerity movement. And similarly, in Spain, we have seen a similar party rise up, and things didn't go so well with Podemos either. So, some tenets of Marxism, I think, are definitely things that are valid and can really guide us from and avoid us from making mistakes, etc. Now, the thing, though, is that you can have as many interpretations of Marx as there are stripes of socialists. For example, the fact is that Marx was used by the Stalinist dictatorships to maintain control over this bureaucratic state capitalist mode of economy and production, and that for example, the fact that Marx survived that Marxism has made a comeback is a testament to its power, basically. But there's other sort of examples of people using Marxism in a very dogmatic and counterproductive way. One can say, for example, most of the followers of Leon Trotsky, thought, because Trotsky said, made a prediction that didn't come out, that the prediction was that the Second World War was going to lead to the collapse of capitalism in the West, and that in the Stalinist bloc, that there would be a workers' revolution that would overthrow the bureaucracy, and this would open the way again for a real worker state. Well, that didn't happen. And when that didn't happen, the vast majority of Trotskyists didn't stop and think, well, maybe Trotsky was wrong on this side of one thing, but he was a tremendously important revolutionary who kept the idea of socialism from below alive. But, maybe he was wrong on this one thing. So instead, they tried to twist reality to fit this mistake and went into all sorts of hurdles that really did not help the Trotskyist cause at all. Now, I think that, in our tradition, because we see Marxism and Marx's, ideas as part of a living and breathing, sort of guide to action, we have avoided a lot of those really terrible mistakes that other socialists didn't. But, I said this in the opening, Marx was just, in fact, a revolutionary. He was an organizer, and he wrote to address specific concerns of his and of the workers' movement, and to understand capitalism, but he wasn't trying to impress people by writing nice academic lectures. It was all about how to put this to action with the aim of ultimately enabling the workers to overthrow capitalism and destroy it, and replace it with a socialist society where workers run the economy, workers decide what gets produced, where workers will end oppression, will end racism, will end sexism, will end the oppression against trans people, against indigenous people, and we will live in a much more just and more reasonable world where the horrors that we are seeing today will not take place. And we can get this. We can get there. The real alarming development of late is climate change and how rapidly we're heading in a very bad place. So this again shows that we really need to strengthen groups like the International Socialist, groups like Marx 21, because we are going to destroy capitalism ourselves, but we want to enter with our ideas into the workers' movement, into the social movements, with the best ideas about how to win. And I think this is really the gist of it, that Marxism is just a tool in that direction. It's a set of ideas that will guide us. So I wanted to say before I close that if you're not a member of Marx 21 in the International Socialists, please join us, because we are trying to bring these ideas to a lot of people, and ultimately we want to build the kind of organizations of socialists who are armed with the best possible ideas for winning. And this is definitely something that I think is worth fighting for our future. So thanks, and I'm going to end here.
Thanks a lot, Yanni. That was great. So thanks for coming to this meeting. And as I said, the next 3 sessions will be starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, or I think that's 2:31. I'm not sure what time that is, Pacific Time, 12:30 perhaps. So the next meetings will be starting in about 25 minutes. And you can probably also join one of the other 2 meetings in session if you want to do that. So thanks for coming.